Well, it's another wonderful evening here at Christian Thinker Society. I'm Jeremiah Johnston, welcoming you to another great session, and I have with me the distinguished professor of New Testament scholarship at the Dallas Theological Seminary, joining us live tonight, Professor Daniel B. Wallace. Professor Wallace is a titan of New Testament scholarship, a world-renowned lecturer, a prolific and best-selling author, and probably has personally seen and held within his grasp more ancient biblical manuscripts than any individual living. It's an honor to have you tonight, Professor Wallace. Dr. Wallace also influences students across the country through his textbook on intermediate Greek grammar, which I personally have used, many others. It's used in more than 2/3 of the nation's schools that teach the subject. I have in my hand The Basics of New Testament Syntax and Intermediate Greek Grammar by Professor Daniel B. Wallace, an excellent, excellent tool. Great job on that. He's also the senior editor of the Net Bible, a great new Bible translation, and co-editor of the Nestle Allen English Diglot. Recently, his scholarship has shifted from syntactical and text-critical issues to more specific work in the Gospels of John, Mark, and nascent Christology. However, he still works extensively in the field of textual criticism, and he founded the Center of the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, an institute with an initial purpose to preserve Scripture by taking digital photographs of all known Greek New Testament manuscripts. And I can't wait to ask you about that, Professor Wallace. His postdoctoral work includes work on Greek grammar at the Tyndall House in Cambridge and textual criticism studies at the Institute for New Testament Textual Research in Münster, Germany. When he's not involved in all these wonderful scholarly endeavors, which encourage so many of us across the world, Dr. Wallace and his wife Patty enjoy spending time with their boys and their beagles. So, Professor Wallace, again, thank you for taking time to join us tonight at Christian Thinker Society.
Thank you, Jeremiah. It's a pleasure for me to be here.
I also want to show these wonderful books. I've got with me just a few from my library, Dethroning Jesus, Darrell Bach and Daniel B. Wallace, Exposing Popular Culture's Quest to Unseat the Biblical Christ. I have this book in my grasp. And then a wonderful tool for the church at large, Reinventing Jesus, How Contemporary Skeptics Miss the Real Jesus and Mislead Popular Culture. This book has just been a great tool that, again, was written for the popular audience and written so well, but also some great scholarly information. So, Professor Wallace, I want to get right into it. Here at Christian Thinker Society, I get texted questions every week from the live audience and from those watching via streaming and over the broadcast. And not a week goes by now that I'm not receiving questions relating to textual criticism. Bart Ehrman's books, of course, his most recent on ancient Christian forgeries. Of course, we've had Bart Ehrman here for a debate at First Family Church and Christian Thinker Society. Text criticism has gone mainstream. It's gone best-selling. It's become popular. A topic that used to be quite a yawn is now something that is even talked about on headline news channels. The origin of the New Testament, Bart Ehrman says, has been corrupted by copyists so badly that we can no longer recover it. You have a different take on this whole issue. You're an expert in textual criticism, and so I want to begin tonight by asking you two questions. First, for our audience here at Christian Thinker Society, can you just give a 101 description of what textual criticism is? That's kind of a scary phrase to some Christians. And then secondly, can you respond to so much of this misconception of Ehrman of 400,000 errors or variants in the New Testament, and just talk for a moment, given your expertise through your magisterial studies on just the integrity of the New Testament?
I'll be happy to do the best job that I can. Thanks for the questions. First of all, let me address the word criticism. Criticism, when it comes to ancient study, doesn't mean to be subjectively critical of a document or of a theory or a viewpoint or interpretation. Rather, it means to be doing research. And so if you think of textual criticism as textual research, then you have a far more positive attitude about it. And at the same time, that's what it's called, is textual criticism. But just replace in your mind the word research for criticism and you'll understand it better. Textual criticism is actually the foundational science for investigating all literature prior to the printing press. The reason is because all manuscripts prior to the printing press had differences among themselves when compared to the original document. So This is true for the New Testament. It's true for all classical Greek and Roman literature and virtually all other ancient literature. We have to do textual criticism on these manuscripts precisely because no two of them agree with each other.
Thank you for that phenomenal answer, Professor Wallace. I'm just amazed at how naive some Christians can be on this issue, and that's why I thank God for your work, both in the scholarly community and then equipping so many students, but also your work at the Center for New Testament Manuscript Studies and how you're equipping the lay people at large to really think through these issues. I mean, it's time for us to get past our Sunday school theology and the Sunday school Bible stories in a lot of these areas, and that it's something we need to shy away from. It's something we need to jump into, and yet when we do that, the truth is still on our side, and we can come away with it, stronger Christians and more undergirded in our faith. So thank you. I want to move on to some of these ancient Christian books because, as I said in my introduction of you, Professor Walsh, you have such a handle, literally, on the ancient Christian texts, both the scrolls, the codices, the fragments. What did ancient Christian, for the benefit of our audience at large, what did ancient Christian books per se look like? What distinguished them from other books in the ancient world? What were some of the noticeable things that you've seen in your research?
It's very interesting about these ancient Christian books that I would say, on the one hand, there's been one time in the church's history where we were ahead of the technological curve, and it was when it came to the particular book form that Christians used at the very beginning. The book form that everybody used until towards the very end of the first century was a scroll or a roll, which we all know about. We assume that all these ancient books were written that way. But the codex form, which is our modern book form, where it's bound on one side and the pages are cut and you can flip through them, most of your viewers are familiar with the codex. Some of them have used computers from their kindergarten days, so they don't know what a codex is. They only know what a scroll is, which is a retro kind of a view. But most understand what a codex is. But that was, we don't know who invented the codex form, but what we do know is that the early Christians were the first ones to really popularize it and use it almost exclusively. In the first 500 years AD, 80% of all Christian books were written on a codex. Meanwhile, only 20% of all non-Christian books were written on a codex. And so it was the Christians who moved all of society towards using the codex form. That's the first thing that's significant, and it makes them very distinct. So these early Christian books, especially Scripture, all copies of the New Testament that we have in Greek, are written on a codex or on the back of a scroll where that would have been blank and they just used it for some other purpose where some other text was on the front of the scroll. Now, the second thing that makes Christian books unusual, and this is a very distinctive thing about the Christian books that helps us to immediately see when we're looking at thousands upon thousands of ancient documents, oh, we can say this is a Christian document because of this feature. It's called nomina sacra, or sacred names. And there are 15 different words that eventually came to be used in these Christian books, especially in the New Testament, but even in the translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint, put into Greek, and other Christian writings. There were these 15 names that were abbreviated, and they had a horizontal bar over the word to indicate, don't read this as a word, recognize that it's an abbreviation. Now, the first four words that were used were God, Christ, Lord, and Jesus. That's extremely significant because it tells us, most likely, that the early Christians viewed Jesus as deity. And they most likely got this idea from the whole business of using Yahweh in the Old Testament Hebrew texts and pointing it with vowels for Adonai. Now, that may be too much for your viewers to grasp, but I'm sure you probably talked about this in other shows, or you will soon. And so you can do all the cleanup of this interview if you'd like. But the fact is that they have these nomina sacra, and from our very earliest manuscripts of the New Testament, we have the nomina sacra. We don't know who invented it, we don't know why it came about, but we do know that this is what we find in the very earliest manuscripts, which is extremely significant. There's a third thing that is not very often talked about, and this is significant, and I'm working on some material to finally publish on this, and it is that the earliest manuscripts we have in the New Testament were not written in a literary hand. That is, they were not written by scribes who were trained in writing literature, but they were rather written in a documentary hand. And a documentary hand is one by somebody who is trained to be an accountant, a CPA, a bureaucrat, a pencil pusher, that kind of a person. Somebody who is left brain and almost OCD. And so the typical seminary students fit this category a lot. But it's that kind of a person who will not be creative with the text. And that's an extremely important point. Well, how do we know that it's written by somebody like that? Well, not only does it have the documentary hand, which is a different kind of a handwriting than the literary hand, but also the use of numbers in our earliest New Testament manuscripts are written as though they are nomina sacra. They might use alpha with a horizontal bar over it, which means the number 1. Don't read this as the letter alpha. And they might use the letter lambda for the number 40, this kind of a thing. So this is the kind of a thing that suggests that our earliest New Testament manuscripts were written by people who were not creative with the text. They were literate, they could read and write, but they were not creative thinkers. They were the kinds of people who wanted to make exact copies. And those 3 features, the codex, the nomina sacra, and the documentary hand, suggest that from a very early period, the New Testament manuscripts were copied pretty darn faithfully.
In Chapter 5 of Reinventing Jesus, I'm holding it in my hand here, the book written by Professor Wallace, you give some myths about manuscripts, and these are salient things as we approach the whole issue of the integrity of the New Testament, because they shed light on a lot of the fallacies that we hear purported by liberal theologians and those that don't believe in the authority of the Bible. Do you mind just walking us through Chapter 5 of this book and perhaps some of those myths for the benefit of our audience? And I encourage everyone in our audience, if you don't have this, to go on Amazon or to go to your nearest Christian bookstore and get Reinventing Jesus by Professor Wallace.
I'll be happy to talk about the myths. There's really 3 that I want to address, and I'm sure we can address some of the details of one of these questions in a later question. But first is a myth that many Christians have about the Bible, and that's the myth of absolute certainty. We tend towards this attitude. It's especially found among King James Version advocates. But even in the first printing of the King James Bible in 1611, there were 8,000 marginal variants, marginal readings that indicated that they weren't sure exactly how to translate that word, or they weren't sure what the exact text was. Those marginal notes have been deleted in later printings of the King James, and it's this myth of absolute certainty that comes from the printing press. Until the time of the printing press, nobody could have endured that kind of a myth, because every manuscript was different from every other manuscript. Only after the printing press can you have all the documents of the Bible be exactly like each other if they're done on the same printing press. So that's a myth we need to stay away from. And one of the things that is important for Christians to recognize is that we can have a very strong certainty about the essentials of the Christian faith without necessarily having to have an absolute certainty about all of the details of what the original word said. Our faith needs to be nuanced, and it needs to be rooted in history. And if we do that, I think we'll be on much safer ground.
The second myth is the myth of total despair or total skepticism. And that's a myth that says we can't possibly tell what the original New Testament said because the copies were waiting so long before we get any of those copies. And some would even go so far as to say we're waiting centuries before we get any copies. Even a scholar of the level of Bart Ehrman, who is a very fine textual critic, has made that statement both in writing and in lectures. In a debate that I had with him 3 years ago, he said, we're waiting hundreds of years before we get any copies. He knows that that's not true. We have between 4 and 12 copies of portions of the New Testament within a century of the completion of it. And so there's no need for us to have this total despair or total skepticism. Not only that, but I'll address this later, but the New Testament is better attested than any other ancient Greco-Roman literature, by far. In fact, it is so far and away better attested that it's embarrassing how well attested it is. Finally, there's the myth about modern translations, and the myth goes like this. As time goes on, we're getting farther and farther away from the original text.
We can't possibly know what the original text said, and this is a myth that is not really very carefully reflected on, but it's the assumption that, oh, when these translators looked at this Greek manuscript, they get done with it, and then they grab their Zippo lighter and torch the darn thing. Well, nobody does that. We still have the manuscripts that stand behind the King James Bible. We not only have those 6 manuscripts that were the original Greek text behind the King James that go back to the 12th century. That's as early as they were. But we have today almost 1,000 times as many manuscripts as what the King James translators used, and the earliest go back 1,000 years earlier than what the King James translators used. So our data are absolutely vast, and we are not getting farther and farther away from the original. As time goes on, we're getting closer and closer to the original text.
Professor Wallace, this answer is so phenomenal, and I want to encourage, again, everyone to read Chapter 5 of the whole book, but especially Chapter 5 of Reinventing Jesus. Can you just drill down a little deeper for a moment? Because we have a lot of new believers here at Christian Thinker Society, a lot of Christians formative in their faith, just who recently come to Christ or growing. And can you just walk us back through answer number 1 that you gave of this difference between an absolute certainty but maintaining a faith grounded in historicity? Do you mind just preaching a little bit to us, Professor Wallace, about the importance of what you just said? Because I want to make sure no one missed it who's listening to you.
I'll be happy to do that. I think that one of the fundamental problems of evangelicalism today is that we are anti-incarnational. And what I mean by that is that we are not grounding our faith essentially in the incarnation of the Son of God. If God became man in time-space history, and he subjected himself to the life on this planet where we all know the story about the obscurity of his birth and the questions about the ethics of his parents and dying a criminal's death on a cross, all this kind of thing. And he did miracles in certain places, certain times, to certain people. We have witnesses to those events. Then the Bible is such a document that it actually subjects itself to historical verification like no other sacred text in the world. That's the remarkable thing about the Bible, is that here God is saying, I am the sovereign God of the universe, but I'm going to show you who I am in your own time-space history, and I'm going to ask you to investigate this. The incarnation puts the stamp of approval on historical investigation more than anything I could ever possibly imagine or discuss. The problem we have is sometimes we front-load our view of the Bible by saying, this is the infallible, maybe even the inerrant Word of God, and we say that up front. And when we say that, we say, hands off my Bible. I'm not going to ask the tough historical questions. Well, the reality is that the incarnation demands that we ask those tough historical questions, and sometimes we pit our view of the Bible against our view of Christ, and Christ loses. But when we examine things historically, now all of a sudden it moves out of the realm of like a test tube in a chemical lab where you can repeat the same experiment and get exactly the same answers over and over again. We're dealing with the vagaries of human thought, the gaps in the materials, and we have to put this together as best we can. And the remarkable thing is that with all of that, with all of the things working against it, with the Diocletian persecution at the beginning of the 4th century and earlier and later persecutions of the Christian church where they were destroying scriptures left and right, with all that working against it, the remarkable thing is the amazing number of copies we have of the New Testament and early copies so that we can, in all essential respects, get back to that wording. But we have to be very careful not to say, I have an absolute certainty about these things. That really is the daughter of modernism, to say those kinds of things, and it's not a particularly Christian viewpoint.
Thank you so much for that response. I'm talking with Professor Danny Wallace of Dallas Theological Seminary. In a microscopic way, I have experienced a little bit of what you've experienced, Professor Wallace, the absolute exhilaration of holding some of the oldest copies of the Word of God, and I've held even some of the oldest copies of the Apocryphal Gospels that date back to the 2nd century and others. and just the exhilaration of the stories behind these texts and what that's done for my spiritual life. I work in the papyrology lab at the Oxyrhynchus Room at Oxford, and you have seen and probably taken pictures of and tangibly held more Bible manuscripts than anyone in the world. And I wish we had all the time in the world tonight to hear these stories, but it reminds me of chapter 6. I segue that thought to chapter 6 of your book, Reinventing Jesus, where, again, you give an explanation of, you hear preachers and teachers toss around this word, we have 5,000 Greek manuscripts. Well, we actually have 24,000 manuscripts, I think, before the invention of the printing press, when you go through the Latin, Syriac, Coptic, Greek, etc. But can you just take us again back through those 5,000 Greek manuscripts? You do it in chapter 6 so well. Can you just give us an updated knowledge of what are those? We hear that term a lot. We kind of check off, okay, but what is that really when we say, and how significant is that?
Yes, the numbers are actually now even higher than 5,000. We went with very conservative figures in Reinventing Jesus. The latest count by the Institute for New Testament Textual Research in Münster, Germany, is 5,805 Greek New Testament manuscripts. But as you already noted, there's over 10,000 Latin manuscripts and somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 manuscripts in other ancient versions like Coptic and Syriac and Old Church Slavonic and Armenian and all the rest of the languages. So that gives us a total of between 20 and 25,000 New Testament manuscripts. The remarkable thing is, if you were to have a magic wand and you wipe out all those manuscripts in one fell swoop, we still would not be left without a witness. And that's because church fathers, the leaders of the church, the elders, pastors, bishops, from the late 1st century all the way through the 15th century, we count these church fathers, they wrote commentaries on the New Testament, and they preached on the New Testament. And so they have homilies that we have recorded. And there's a place in Boiron, Germany, that has been cataloging these quotations from the New Testament by the church fathers. Now, we have just under 8,000 verses in the Greek New Testament. The actual number is 7,941. And in this institute in Boiron, they have been cataloging the patristic quotations of the New Testament, and I think it was about 30 years ago that they hit over 1 million quotations of the New Testament by the church fathers. Now, when you begin to think about that, over 1 million quotations of the New Testament by the church fathers, less than 8,000 verses. This means that a number of these verses are quoted dozens of times. And we can duplicate the entire New Testament many times over just in the quotations of the church fathers. Now, let me compare that to the ancient Greco-Roman literature. Let me talk about, to start with, an average Greek writer. We have fewer than 20 copies of that are still existing of the original documents of any Greek writer on average. In fact, that average of 20 is really enormously high. It's usually 2 or 3 copies that we have, but I'm just giving the benefit of the doubt in this direction. If you were to stack those manuscripts up, they'd be about 4 feet high. Now, you take all of our manuscripts of the New Testament that we know about, and not counting the church fathers, I have no idea how to stack that up. How high would the stack be? It would be more than a mile high, more than 1 mile high of materials. We have an embarrassment of riches that no other discipline of the ancient world has to deal with. And it's remarkable how much material we have for the New Testament. In fact, I would say this. If we're going to have doubts about what the New Testament manuscripts say about Jesus, then those doubts need to be multiplied 1,000 times over for virtually any other classical literature, for any other historical figure. And consequently, if I'm going to be that skeptical about the New Testament, I might as well throw out 99% of what I know about the ancient world, because I can't rely on any of the manuscripts to tell me about it. Nobody is that skeptical.
Wow. Now, in your next book, which I just really appreciated, you wrote with fellow Professor Darrell Bach, Dethroning Jesus, Exposing Popular Culture's Quest to Unseat the Biblical Christ. You use a term that I'm going to ask you just to define because I find it intriguing. Jesusanity. Can you discuss what trend you're talking about, and can you just say that word and what you mean by it? Can you define it for us?
I want to give credit to Darrell Bach. That's actually his term that he came up with, and I thought it was a brilliant term to use. And what he essentially is arguing in what we are arguing in Dethroning Jesus is that there are two versions of how Jesus is viewed. There is Christianity, which views him as the Christ, or the Messiah. And if he's the Messiah, then he's the Son of God and all the implications that go with that. Then there's Jesusanity. And Jesusanity is a view that many scholars, liberal scholars, would hold to, where they have a high view of Jesus. It's very important for Christians to recognize that liberal scholars don't think Jesus is one step away from Hitler. No, they think that he's a great man, a wise teacher, and they're effervescent about how wonderful he is. But they stop short of calling him the Messiah. They stop short of calling him the Son of God. They stop short of saying that he actually did real miracles, and they definitely stop short of saying that he rose from the dead. Those are the two views of Jesus, and if we understand that liberal scholarship doesn't have a negative view of Jesus, but that they don't have as positive a view of Jesus as the church has historically held, and that the view of Jesus that they have is one in which if you put your faith in him, it does absolutely nothing, then we understand much better what they're saying.
Sounds like a lot of preachers I know too, Professor Wallace, so thank you for that explanation. And I just appreciate this book so much, Dethroning Jesus. It's a real glimpse of what's really going on today among the different schools of thought, especially in biblical scholarship. I want to move on to this wonderful center that you founded. It's a center that I personally use in my scholarship. It's something that everyone uses that I know in Oxford. It's called the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. You're the founder of it. You're the executive director. Can you just tell us your vision for this institute? How did it begin, and where's it going?
Yes, I started it in 2002, and the basic vision of CSNTM is, first of all, to digitally photograph every single Greek New Testament manuscript in the world and put those images online to make them available for scholars and other interested persons for free. Now, we are not shooting all the manuscripts. Other sites are starting to photograph their own, and we're providing links to those. So if we don't photograph everything, we'll at least have links where people can access this stuff for free. That's extremely important. It's 2.6 million pages of text that need to be photographed. So this is good job security for me, and I don't think I'm going to quit on this job for any time soon. The second goal and the final objective is to use these photographs and develop some software to be able to scan them much more quickly than humans can do, and develop ultimately the genealogical relationships among the existing manuscripts to help us recover the wording of the original text. So it's from making digital photographs so that we can use software to be applied to that, and then from there recovering the original text as much as is humanly possible. That's the goal of CSNTM.
And that is fascinating to me because, you know, there's been a lot of recent scholarship that some of our earliest fragments and manuscripts may not be the best. They might not have been as pure a strand as others that are, you know, maybe 50 years younger. And so I find this interesting, what you're doing, and I encourage everyone who's watching to support this wonderful Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts with your prayers, your financial backing, and go to the website and check it out. Join the blog. It's something that even Christian lay people would just find intriguing and interesting. Now I want to just talk for the benefit of our audience too about these travels you've had, because I've heard you lecture, I've heard you interview, you've had some, you know, anytime you get on some of these what I would refer to as wild trips where you're finding these manuscripts. I mean, these are not some of these at air-conditioned libraries like we would be accustomed to here in the Midwest. What were some of the most intriguing encounters that you've had thus far in your very Indiana Jones-esque travels that you've had looking at these manuscripts, Professor Wallace? Can you just share with us some of the stories?
Sure. There's so many to share. We could go on all night, but I'll try to limit it to just a few. But first of all, I need to make a gentle correction about the Indiana Jones kind of Innuendo. Indiana Jones, was, as much as we love watching him on the big screen, he was an American imperialist thief. And what he did was took things from poorer cultures so they could go in museums in the States. And that really it's just theft. It's not respecting those cultures. What we do is we never take those manuscripts from those sites. Our number one priority is to respect the people who own those manuscripts, and we preserve them as best we possibly can. And so we handle them with kid gloves, literally, and we take care of them in tremendous ways. But let me just tell you a few stories about some of the places and things we do. We go to Patmos several times. We've been there, I think, 4 or 5 times already, the island where John wrote the book of Revelation. And there's this hotel that we stay at that it's run by a family. They're great people, but you have to be very careful not to offend locals about anything, and that includes eating what they put in front of you. Well, the grandfather sort of figure that owns this hotel was down at the harbor, and he came home with what I called sea urchin surprise. It was sea urchins that had been hollowed out, and then their stuffing was put back in with some salt. I don't think it was cooked. And he's saying, hey, we've got this great stuff for you. He didn't speak any English, so he's speaking in modern Greek, and we're trying to understand him. And he says, you got to try this. And so he's forcing it down our throats. And one of the guys was trying to be polite, and he ended up having 5 of these things, and it tastes like fuzzy salt. It's not a pleasant experience, but I just thought that was hilarious how many this guy got stuck with. Well, the next year we came back, and he skedaddled. He was out of there, and I was the one who got stuck eating extra sea urchin surprises. So that's just part of what happens. So in a recent trip I had to Indonesia, I met the president of the largest seminary in Indonesia, in Malang, and I was trying to work on my Indonesia. I was lecturing for 2 weeks on textual criticism throughout the country before hundreds of people at any given time. And when I met the seminary president, I decided to speak a little Indonesian to him, and it was the first time I really tried to do it. And I asked him, how are you? But I had transposed a couple of the consonants, and it ended up being, why are you on fire? And so, those kinds of things, you hear missionaries say that all the time, but I'm trying. Anytime I get into a local culture, I try to work with that language and do what I can to speak it, and sometimes you get mistakes like that. In terms of exciting news, there has been so much excitement for us, it's really hard to contain, but always the most exciting thing on any expedition is when we would discover a manuscript. A manuscript that is unknown to Western scholars. It may well be known to that library, and we're not claiming that we are discovering something that they don't know about. We are claiming that we are making this known to the Institute in Munster. TM has discovered approximately 70 manuscripts, New Testament manuscripts, since our beginning, which is more than all the individuals and institutes in the world collectively have discovered in that same time period. So the Lord has been very gracious to us to open up these doors and get us to discover manuscripts. One that was really important, I think, was in Constantinople, or Istanbul. We were at the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople in 2004. And the way they have their library system, their manuscripts are simply numbered 1 through 300. That's about how many manuscripts they have. And when a manuscript goes missing, they just cross off the spine that number, and they make it go down to the previous number. So you have no gaps in the sequence, but the catalog, which is 100 years old, becomes out of date as soon as any manuscript goes missing. And so we kept asking the librarian assistants to bring out the manuscripts. We said, no, this is not the right one. We kept bringing out the wrong ones, which was actually wonderful because we discovered 3 New Testament manuscripts on that expedition because they brought manuscripts that we were not supposed to be looking at. And one of them was actually a majuscule manuscript of Mark's Gospel. Now, majuscule is capital letters. It's essentially the demarcation is first millennium manuscripts are capital letters, second millennium AD are minuscule letters. And there had been no majuscule letter manuscripts ever known to be in Constantinople in modern times. We discovered 3 of them. And this one from the Gospel of Mark now has an official number. It's 0322, and I think the date is at about the 7th century. But the reason we discovered it was a palimpsest. It was the undertext of a parchment for the last 2 leaves of an in-house diary. And you get to those last 2 leaves, and you can barely see that there's some text there that had been scraped over by a scribe several centuries later. We held it up to the window light, saw that there was text. We could make out only 2 or 3 letters per page, but we were able to determine that one leaf was from Mark 3, the other one was Mark 6.
You know, and that's so significant because I'm here in my office and I'm just looking at the distribution of early papyri witness, and I mean, am I right that the Gospel of Mark here with my list is has the fewest attestation of the early Gospel fragments? And I mean, this is significant that you found some more Markan fragments here. This is extremely significant.
Yes, you're exactly right. We have, I think, 1/3 copy manuscript of Mark, which is part of P45, and then it gets, later on we get more copies, but we actually have more copies of the Shepherd of Hermas in the early centuries than we do of Mark's Gospel. And there's a number of reasons for that, but one of the reasons, I believe, is that Mark was viewed as swallowed up by Matthew. I mean, 95% of Mark is found in Matthew, and so why copy out both Gospel manuscripts? Let's go with the one that's got the fuller story. And I think it was actually Irenaeus who, in his comment about how the Gospels had been as secure and as well-founded as the 4 winds of the earth, was really using an apologetic to reestablish Mark as a valid Gospel because it came from Peter's testimony. Yeah. And so if you've got that kind of thing going on, you can understand why Mark was not copied that much. But by the time we get to the end of the 2nd century, you've got patristic writers saying all 4 Gospels are canonical. Let's get those copied. And so it took a little while to get that ticking off.
Have you had a chance to study the handwriting of these 2 fragments you found? Do you have any kind of date range of this manuscript that you've all discovered of Mark?
It's extremely difficult to date it by the handwriting because the letters we can barely make them out. But there's also rubrication or red lettering in the margins that was not able to be scraped off. And if that's from the same period, then that becomes significant. These are what's called Eusebian canons, telling the reader where they are in the Gospels. And that's how we could actually find out, oh, this looks like it's Mark 3. Let's see if we can get any of the letters to line up. And Münster has suggested a date, I think, of about the 7th century. So it's not as early as we had originally hoped and wanted it to be, but it is still a first millennium manuscript, and only about 15% of our manuscripts are first millennium. So it's always exciting to find one of those.
So significant. Again, I'm speaking with Professor Daniel Wallace of Dallas Theological Seminary. You're watching Christian Thinker Society. If you've missed any part of this interview, I encourage you to go to our website at Jeremiah J. Johnston and check it out and watch it in its entirety. Our final question for you this evening, Professor Wallace. Here at Christian Thinker Society, our passion is training Christians to become thinkers and encouraging thinkers to become Christian. And we really have been training our people in the defense of the gospel, as 1 Peter 3:15 says, as Jude says, to contend for the faith, how to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, and mind. How important is it what you're doing to not just be something we do in the academy, but something that all Christians are aware of, the subject of textual criticism and how that can be transposed into an apologetic for belief and for reaching people? How important is it for what you're doing to get the message out to the church at large?
Textual criticism has become perhaps the most important apologetic issue for the early 21st century. And I think the reason it has become this is because of the rapid move into postmodern thought, where in the postmodern skepticism essentially says we will allow every viewpoint except the Christian viewpoint. And that's the one that we're going to be the most skeptical about. It's remarkable what has happened in the last 15 to 20 years in terms of the skepticism and the pushback on the dates of manuscripts and the reliability of this kind of thing by postmodern textual critics. Now, the old question used to be,
are these miracles really true in the Bible? Did they really happen? Now the question is becoming, we're not so sure the Bible even taught that stuff originally. We're asking the question, what did the Bible originally say? And so it goes back to the old question that the serpent asked Eve in the garden, what did God really say? And so in that respect, it is extremely important for Christians to be familiar with these issues. And in this internet age, where somebody can look up a question instantly, if you say, well, my pastor said this, you've got a non-Christian who can look that up and see a response to that question instantly, which is simply not something that could have happened 20 years ago. And so Christians need to have a lot more savvy. Their pastors need to be more engaged with the issues and sharing these issues with their lay people instead of keeping them in the dark. And especially because of the Muslim influence that's sweeping across the world, their pushback on the Christian scriptures is that you guys say this is the Word of God, but there's mistakes in your manuscripts. There's no mistakes in our manuscripts, and so ours is the Word of God. But it's important for us to interact both with understanding our own scriptures and what Muslims say about theirs.
Well, and I encourage you here at Christian Thinker Society to look up our night on Islam when I interviewed Jay Smith and we talked about the Quran. At least 70% of it from outside sources, at least 225 contradictions. I encourage you to watch that and also to be on the lookout for Keith Small's book on the Quran and textual criticism. Well, it's been an incredible night here at Christian Thinker Society. Our guest has been Professor Dan Wallace. And Professor Wallace, we want to just thank God for everything that he's continuing to use you to do for the kingdom of God, and your scholarship as you approach it, how you're not only approaching it with open-minded, but you're also seeking the truth, and you're using that truth to bless seminary students, scholars, pastors, and now the church at large through these wonderful books you're offering. I hope that you will commit to come back to Christian Thinker Society live in person. We'll fly you up here and take good care of you, give you a good Kansas City steak, filet mignon. We've got good beef up here. I hope you'll come back and see us sometime.
Hi there.
Thank you so much.